Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to Sermon Preparation Workshop and a Happy New Year. It is not our the new year, calendar year, but it is the new church calendar year, and we are here to talk about the first Sunday of Advent. Hi, Sam.
Happy New Year to you.
Are you feeling excited about the new year?
I'm overwhelmed.
I thought so. It is year A, and we're looking at the first Sunday of Advent. So,
What was the Labour manifesto in 2003? So much done, so much to do.
was that it? I don't remember it well. Not things can only get better. That was a bit earlier.
That was 97, I think.
Right, yeah. First Sunday of Advent. I remember we've talked a little bit about Advent before, but it might be good for perhaps some of our newer listeners to maybe give a brief insight into what is Advent all about? How much has it got confused with Christmas? And how much is it okay to just let it be Christmas?
Well, I think Advent was, from early times, a time of fasting and preparation and reflection on the last things, traditionally death, judgment, heaven and hell. And you don't get that many sermons on hell on the Sunday before Christmas these days. And I think in many ways, Advent has become preparation for Christmas, or not even preparation. I mean, just more Christmas, really. Unlike most clergy, I don't think that's a terrible thing, because I think if Christmas represents God's eternal desire to be with us in Christ, then the secular world celebrating it is a rather wonderful thing.
Yeah.
So I really recommend against the curmudgeonly vicar who tells everybody off for celebrating a Christian festival at the wrong time. I mean, really, who cares?
Yeah.
When people say, there's already Christmas decorations on Oxford Street or something, I sort of think you're just getting old, sunshine. There always was.
Yeah.
However, Advent has some significant themes integral to itself, and some of those, as we've talked in the last few weeks, have been absorbed into what was for a while called the Kingdom season and is now just a hodgepodge of dates going from All Saints to Remembrance Sunday if you're in the UK. Now, Safeguarding Sunday, which sits rather oddly in that, and Christ the King. So all of those have a kind of death, end of time feel about them. Well, all but one. So that takes some of the pressure off Advent. But I tend to think of Advent as being about two things now. One is Advent Sunday itself, which I think is a big enough occasion in most places and early enough in the year not to be absorbed into Christmas. And so what I recommend doing is what we do at St. Martin's, which is we go big on Advent, have a big Advent carol service, and sort of do Advent morning and evening. And anything else of Advent you can get in as a bonus. So I think you can usually get away with a John the Baptist Sunday on the second Sunday in Advent. And that's about it.
Yeah.
The third Sunday in Advent is a interesting one, but we'll come to that maybe in a few weeks' time, because it does deal with the kind of questions like, are you the one who is to come, or are we to expect some other, the kind of question of John the Baptist. And so that sense of this isn't working, this hasn't kind of turned out as I hoped, as pastorally, it's a very powerful one.
Yeah.
But by the time you get to Advent 4, the way I usually deal with Advent 4 is doing Christmas from Mary's point of view. So, actually, I really enjoy Advent 4, always have, because there's so many themes to play with. But but that's roughly how I go about it. So Advent Sunday is a big Sunday for preaching, because that is your one real shot at the the big eschatological themes about heaven, about the end of the world, and so on. And that's that's what I think you would want to be talking about this Sunday.
And how do you find it hard sort of balancing then that with people's expectations of what they think they might be coming to if they're going to an Advent carol service and they think they're going to get Christmas?
Well, I try to deal with that by going for something quite visceral. So certainly, we have a tradition of a proper sermon at our Advent carols, but we don't really advertise the sermon very much. I remember saying to a former colleague at St. Martin's, why don't we just put carols after all our services? Eucharist carols, evensong carols, sacred space carols, and we'd multiply by about 4 or 5 the number of people who came to each one. The problem with that is they probably wouldn't be very happy with what they came to.
No, that's not.
So bait and switch. So I guess the most obvious example of this was, I think, last year. I'm afraid I'm getting my years mixed up, but I'm pretty sure this was last year. I preached a sermon about Gaza.
You did, yeah.
Because I felt that the theme was something about peace. And I felt this was the elephant in the room. And I hadn't done a proper sermon on Gaza because, we tend to follow the lectionary and so on. Whereas Advent's carols is one of those occasions where, I do choose readings for that service, but, people are expecting a broader theme. And I've tended to go for something visceral. I'm not sure if you call Gaza visceral, but it's certainly something that kind of cuts through. And while many people have made comments about Gaza in sermons, I wouldn't have thought there'd been that many sermons which are trying theologically to engage with the whole crisis. So I thought that was timely. One person walked out, I remember. But I actually wondered, if I could have chased that guy down the street, if he actually walked out before he got to the part of the sermon that I suspect he might have agreed with. Which is always the problem about walking out of sermons. Anyhow, leaving that aside, in the past, I've tried to go for fairly significant themes in the evening. That's at the more sort of, general public service, more about things like hope. How do you say it's so good? Because it feels pretty awful at the moment. I remember talking quite a lot about a friend who got ME and was more or less housebound for quite a long time, and what words of consolation I could say to him, for example. So, that general sense of it feels pretty awful now, but we're promised that the kingdom is coming is basically what Advent is about. And obviously it then blends or morphs into a different kind of coming as a baby. But it's it's about that tension between the first coming and the second coming at the end of the day.
Yeah, great. Cool. All right. Well, shall we jump into these readings then?
Yeah, I think we can sort of talk as we talk about these readings. We can talk about the real issues about preaching at Advent.
Yeah.
And I guess possibly the best place to start. Well, I think let's take them in reverse order.
Okay.
Let's start with Matthew 24.
Right.
About that day and hour, no one knows, neither the angels of heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. So, this is a square on eschatological passage. That's to say, it's about the last things, and it's based around one of the biggest, if not the biggest, problem in reading the New Testament today, which is that the preponderance of the New Testament is based on assumption the world is coming to an end quite soon.
Yeah.
And it feels from the fact of our existence as if that didn't happen. Now, the counter to that is to say Matthew's Gospel was probably written in about 75 AD, give or take, by which time the end of the world hadn't happened. So most of the ways we critique the New Testament are given to us by the New Testament. There is no Jesus that is not met through the gospel writers and Paul and so on. So if you say, well, Christianity is obviously nonsense because it was, Jesus was an eschatological preacher who expected the end of the world to come and it didn't, so you can't believe anything else he said. The answer to that, which is a pretty reasonable criticism, the answer to that is the people from whom you know that information already knew that the end of the world hadn't come when they wrote it down.
Yeah.
So you'd think if they were a bit embarrassed about that, they'd have left it out, but they didn't leave it out. So that is just a really fascinating thing to wrestle with, and is probably well worth a sermon in its own right. So basically, on Advent Sunday, when you have a reading like this, you've got two choices really. You either dodge it and talk about hope, or I've talked about the 5-act play of creation, covenant, Christ, church, and consummation. I've used that configuration sometimes to say we're living in Act 4. There are a number of ways that you can talk about it, or the alternative, choice 2, is to address it head on and talk about what do we mean by the end of the world. Maybe the word end can mean purpose as well as conclusion, and maybe what Jesus represents is the end, or telos, or purpose of the world, and that in a sense people mistook that for the conclusion of the world. Or if people associated with the end with judgment, then Jesus was that judgment, in a sense that in the presence of Jesus, all and then and today, all of people's true character is revealed. So there's a number of ways you can. So this, if you're going to preach on this passage, you've really got to take on the theological problems brought up by the fact that it seems to say the world's going to end very soon, and it didn't. And people throughout Christian history have said, no, but it's actually the 20th of November, 1851. And, there's a whole litany of, the Shakers, I guess would be a classic example. They don't marry. I think there's still one or two left.
Right.
But obviously there's a major flaw in the succession planning. Sustainability was a problem for the Shakers. So not just about the furniture, so you can do an interesting historical survey. These days you don't even have to have been to university to do that. You just put it into AI and you just say summary of end of the world preaching in history of the church or something, and it'll give you something in half a second probably. So you can obviously form that into a narrative and make quite an interesting sermon about that.
Yeah.
But the point is, it has to be good news. What is the point that you're actually trying to give to your congregation as a point of hope here? And I've suggested what that might be, that you play with the word end and make sure it comes out as purpose rather than conclusion. So that's what I do with that passage.
Can I just ask one theological question about it? In the first verse, in 36, there's sort of suggestion that the Son won't know, but the Father will.
Yeah.
What does that say about the sort of view of the Trinity in this? I mean, obviously the Trinity not necessarily is a articulated concept later, but the idea that the Son wouldn't know.
Yes. So I mean that's a very good question, and there are basically two approaches to answering it. One is a kind of hierarchical subordinationist, technically termed theology, in which the Father is sort of bigger and better than the Son. Obviously we don't like any of that. So the alternative would be an exploration of what is meant by the Son's human nature, and if he is limited by being in one place at a time because he has a physical human body which he retains even after the ascension, then there are some sort of limitations in the Son that aren't there in the Father. And it's the kind of thing that the early theologians discuss endlessly. What does Matthew 24 verse 36 actually mean? That's a really interesting one. But those are roughly the two options, and the first one is theologically, thumbs down, and the second one, it must be some kind of the second one.
Yeah. And I guess, if you're going to use it, it's only if you can point to some good news from it, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I you can preach a sermon about the Trinity, but I don't think that Advent Sunday is the
Not today. Yeah. Cool. All right. Shall we work backwards then and see?
Yes. So I mean, so this is a much more conventional Advent. Well, this is a passage that lends itself to more easily to what I would think of as an Advent sermon. So it has. It isn't really about waking from sleep. I mean, I think that makes for quite a well-trodden path and not a terribly theological one. Wakey kind of thing. But obviously the word woke is related to that sense of being wakened, conscientized, as Paulo Freire would have called it. Awareness is a very contemporary term that activists use a lot. But no, the two lines in here are in the first two verses. Salvation is nearer to us now than when we first believed. I think that's an incredibly evocative line. If you see salvation as the last day, and that's undoubtedly true, but it's not something we think about. But it's begging for, I suppose things that you have to be said sensitively because they are so outside contemporary discourse that people will often get very angry if you say things like this. But actually, they're obviously true. It's just a question of the tone of voice in which you say them, which is if we live our lives, our earthly lives, for a limited time, and we live with God forever beyond our earthly lives, we shouldn't get so upset with a life that's cut short at the age of 30 or something, because it was going to be cut short at the age of 80 anyway. Do you see what I mean? And yet eternity, salvation, in the sense meant in verse 11, is everlasting. So why do we grieve so much for the person we've lost when they have, been given the gift of eternal life? Well, we grieve obviously for ourselves because we miss them.
Yeah.
But we don't necessarily grieve for their eternal well-being. So I mean that begs a sermon on time and eternity.
And how do you recommend doing that pastorally?
Well, I think often when I'm on a difficult subject like that, I will tell a story, either about my own context, or about a friend, or a story from my pastoral experience. Obviously, you have to do that within certain guidelines, but that doesn't mean you don't do it. Or a story from literature, movies, wherever. And I try to get a balance over a year or so in the stories that I tell between ones that are about me, ones are about people I've known, and then ones from literature or film. So you just don't get too predictable.
Sure.
And if you're always telling stories from people you've known, I think people will gradually stop believing you because they think you can't
know that many people.
Many interesting people. And if you're always telling stories about yourself, then obviously that's got a huge limitation as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that I said there were two, but really that's the one. Salvation is nearer. The night is far gone. The day is near. I mean, that image of night, which is a much easier image to work with than the image in the following sentence of darkness, which I think is racially problematic these days. But the image of night there's nothing wrong with that, So always darkest before the dawn, this kind of language. I don't think that's kind of racially laden. Thinking about the darkness and shadows and those sort of features of the night, I think is a very traditional Advent theme. And obviously in the Northern Hemisphere, where we're in the middle of winter, that that's easier to make that connection. But I don't think we should. I think it would be good to preach sermons that work in Australia too.
Ideally.
So that's that's basically that. It looks really bad now, but salvation is coming our way. So just to explain that, teleology, which is our effort to shape our lives towards the future that we want to bring about, as in the phrase that I like to use, living God's future now. That's a sort of teleological way of thinking. But eschatology is something different. Eschatology, unlike teleology that thinks that if we act in the right way, it'll produce the right results eventually, sooner or later. Eschatology thinks that the future comes actually towards us from God. So it isn't a result of our own efforts. So eschatology is theologically the more appropriate thing because it preserves the sovereignty of God. And that's the kind of thing that I think you can talk about in relation to this passage. Because, rather like the dawn, we can't make it happen. It happens sort of to us and around us. Yeah. So, I think that can be both challenging and liberating at the same time.
Yeah, it's a really strong image, actually. That's right there. Yeah.
And that brings us to Isaiah 2, just briefly.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So this, I think, is again a rather different kind of a sermon, which is based on a kind of vision. We think, oh, it's just another passage in Isaiah, but this is a pretty significant image, and might have made quite a challenging passage to preach on at the height of the Gaza crisis, because this is very much an idealized picture of Israel as the source of peace for the nations.
Yeah.
When we, you and I, Christians in the 21st century, read all the nations shall stream to it, we think, oh, that's just using the word nations in the way that the Bible does a lot and some choruses do. But this is we should pick up and stumble when we see this. When most of Isaiah is not about how wonderful the nations are and how they will be blessed by Israel. They're the threat. They're the enemy. So this is a transformation, and obviously it's crystallized into beating swords into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks. This is a wonderful vision of Israel being a source of peace for the world.
Yeah.
You don't need me to say why that would have been a challenging sermon during the height of the Gaza crisis.
No, of course.
It's quite the opposite of what seemed to be happening. But it is an exalted vision, and it does, play a role in Revelation, and it's about hope. It's about peace. So and to the extent that we think Advent is about the coming last day when everything will be sorted out, then I think this is probably the passage you want to preach on if you're talking about what would sorted out look like. And also, a question you have to address, I think, sooner or later when you're talking about the last day, which is it basically heaven come to earth or basically earth come to heaven? I think, most of the language of Christian theology is about earth going up to heaven. But, Tom Wright is a notable biblical scholar in the last generation who's, nailed his colours to the mast of, Revelation and Christian hope is for a transformed earth, and that there still is creatureliness, and he doesn't think we go to heaven in that sense. I'm not where he is, but it still makes for an interesting conversation.
Sure.
So that, I think that would be a very appropriate line to take. So, all of these are quite theological sermons, and really, because you're just not going to exegete these passages line by line. You're just not.
No.
So you just need to take the big theme, and Advent is one of the biggest themes of the year.
Sure. Good. Okay. Well, is there anything else you want to say on Advent before we wrap up?
I think that hopefully that's enough to get everybody's juices flowing on Advent, and we'll look in more detail about the balance between Advent and Christmas in the next couple of weeks, I think.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Sam. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We will continue through Advent together on this journey, and I look forward